So I'm going to do
Does Judith know we can't see her?
Judy and Gordon. You know your video's turned off. I heard them, but maybe
Can you hear us?
we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But
Well,
the video's off.
Yeah, I know. That's because we're moving around in the kitchen attempting to get something to eat, and everything's running late for us. And I thought at very least we might listen in.
All right.
Okay.
But if you're hearing us, I'm concerned
Yeah,
about
we
that. I would turn off my sound if I knew how to do it. It's on my phone.
Let me see if I can do it for you.
Okay.
I think I can. Okay, so I'm going to mute you. So if unmute yourself if you want to jump in or anything like that. So,
but how do I do it on my phone? Do you know?
It should be. I think it's the same place. I think it's down in the lower left.
Oh, okay. I do see it. I didn't think that it was available, but I do see it. I will mute my.
Okay. Well, cool. All right.
She did too.
Yep.
Very good.
So I'm going to light our chalice here. So the reading for our chalice lighting is, let's see, someone just, it comes from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 10.
It's your dad.
Yep, he made it. So, Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, the option of return. And that was the UN's, one of their declarations on it. So to start off with, welcome back, everyone. And I just wanted to touch bases real quick to see if there was anything that came up for any of you from last week's session, or any thoughts that may have come up in between.
Just sad. It's very sad what we did.
Yep.
I'm glad, because I think it was somebody mentioned last week that in like Germany or something, they're teaching like the kids the history and stuff. And like you said, it's just sad that we like to think of ourselves as the greatest country in the world, but yet we decide to pretty much eliminate the history, or decide, or what we do say is make it just seem like, well, everything's good now. And you're like, well, that's not quite that we go, we, stole land, we murdered people, but now everything's okay. You're like, that's not quite how it is, sort of thing.
Well, and they're all gone. They're not here now.
Like we talked about last week with terminal narratives. And
yeah, it's as though they're not here.
I don't know if we will get to this or not. I have it, it's towards the end, but there's something in the book just to keep an eye out for towards the end of it as you're reading it, where they talk about, oh, everything's okay with Native people because they've been assimilated into our culture. And that's another way of erasing them, that you assimilate so they're not different, so they're just the same as you. But there's the last couple of chapters in the book go over that, and hopefully we'll get to that, but that's towards the end, and there's a good amount to discuss. So but what I thought we would start tonight is we're going to first talk about Jefferson and Jackson. And these are some excerpts from the book. As the wealthy owner of a plantation worked by enslaved Africans, Thomas Jefferson was well positioned to play key roles in the formation of the United States. He became president in 1801 and served 2 terms. As a political leader, he was determined to achieve status and expand the United States by taking lands that belonged to Native people and encouraging settlement by white Americans. In 1801, Andrew Jackson, was appointed colonel in the Tennessee militia. He would spend many years as a commander of both state and federal forces, whose main goal was to take over the homelands of indigenous peoples. He became president in 1829 and served 2 terms. Both Jefferson and Jackson owned plantations that would not have succeeded without enslaved laborers. Both had served in the state militia, and both were intent on taking land from indigenous peoples. Jefferson's weapon was political. He crafted policies that gave settlers the clear impression that it was all right to use and take indigenous lands. Jackson's weapon was more literal. With his militias and the U.S. military, he took the lands by force. Some people think of these 2 men as heroic. Native people think otherwise. And I'm going to bring up a couple of questions to guide us in discussion. Just give me a second to share my screen. And I think this is it. Nope, there it is. All right, can you all see it?
Yep.
All right. So, did someone else say something?
We see your screen, but it's a list of like your downloads and stuff. It's not the actual.
Let me see if I can enlarge it here. Give me 1 second.
It's like your files, like where they're stored.
All right. A little bit better.
It looks like you shared the wrong screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's just a list of like what's on your PC under your downloads folder.
Interesting, because I was seeing it, but hold on 1 second. Let me try it again. Okay. All right. I clicked it. I see where I went wrong. Now can you see it?
Not yet.
Oh.
There we go.
Yep, there it is.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, we'll go through the 3 questions here. I'll read the first one if someone would take the second, and then another person the third. The Jefferson or Jackson legacies both include enslavement of African people and stealing of indigenous lands. Whether you recently learned this information or have known it for a long time, how has this knowledge changed your view of the U.S. history?
Until recently, many white Unitarian Universalists lifted up Thomas Jefferson as a Unitarian forebear worthy of celebration. What changes when commonly celebrated figures of Unitarian or Universalist history are viewed from an indigenous perspective and/or from the perspective of people of color?
Now that you know, if you didn't know before, what response does this information perspective require from you? If you already knew about Jefferson and Jackson legacies regarding indigenous people and people of color, how have you shared that information with others, including children in your life?
Katie, with the second question, if you want to just think about that in terms of just how many white Americans lift up Thomas Jefferson and look at it through that lens, if that helps with that.
Okay.
Any thoughts on any of these questions?
Yeah, I remember when we were the Thomas Jefferson district, and then we brought that up and voted to change it. But there was some resistance. But it's now not that. And I'm having a senior moment, Mark. What are we called?
What are we called now?
Yeah.
Oh, we're the Southern region.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they changed it to regions.
Yeah, all of a sudden it was totally gone from my mind. But yeah.
This isn't exactly with indigenous, but just what Chloe just said. I mean, for those of you who may not know, I mean, yeah, I was part of the Thomas Jefferson district as well when I lived in Richmond. And back at GA in, I can't remember what year, but they were going to have a Thomas Jefferson celebration. It was a anniversary, and they encouraged people to wear period clothing. And this did not go over very well with the people of color who were there at that General Assembly, because they were like, what are we supposed to wear? And that was where a lot of discussion came from. And there was a lot of good discussion that came out of that. But that was just a little bit of tangential knowledge.
Well, there's like the Jefferson Monument, which gets into the whole, I haven't heard much about that monument, but that gets into the whole monuments and what should people do with them. You know, whether they should be completely destroyed or whether they should be put in a museum so that people who want to look at them can, but it's not an everyday reminder to those people whose cultures were affected by it, that they walk by that way every day going to work or drive by that way and have to see it, sort of thing. Is Jefferson part of Mount Rushmore?
No, I don't think so.
I'm gonna sadly say that I can't. I think he is.
That's what I was thinking. I've never been to a Mount Rushmore, but I was thinking he was one of them.
We'll see.
Because I have seen some stuff about, there have been like some discussions in that side of the country about changing that, although that's like in a mountain, so I don't know how easy that is to get rid of. But
it's Jefferson, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Washington. So
yeah. So there you have not just a monument, but a mountain saying, oh, by the way, here's a reminder. And like I said, I've seen some stuff that talked about, like in that part of the country, people wanting it torn down. But how do you tear down a mountain?
That's, yeah. It's sorry, go on.
They sculpted it, so whatever tools they used to sculpt it, they could smooth it out.
True. I mean, not literally tear down a mountain, but just.
There's a similar carving, well, not similar, but there is also a problematic carving on Stone Mountain in Atlanta. It's got Lee on it, and I forget who else. Confederate generals.
It's Lee, Stonewall Jackson, I think maybe Jefferson Davis, but I'm not sure. But that's another.
Can't remember.
Well, it goes with Mount Rushmore. It goes even beyond the fact that it's just a reminder of the colonizing history of the history of America. It was sacred to the Lakota Sioux. It was known as the Six Grandfathers. And that is sacred land to the Lakota Sioux, and they would like it back. So we destroyed a very sacred mountain to them by carving images of famous figures for white people.
Wow, we should let them decide what to do with it.
There are some people that say that we should let them decide what they want to do with it, but that whole area is considered sacred to them,
which is why they protested when Trump was there.
Well, and then like think about money, like who's on the faces of money? Like it's all white people.
Yep.
Whether you're talking about dollar bill, $5 bill, 10, 20, or just even coins.
And I mean, the one person that they tried to include as a person of color, Harriet Tubman, was supposed to replace Jackson, but
didn't happen.
Hopefully it'll happen with the next administration, but we shall see. But I'm one of those who grew up. I mean, of course, being Tennessean, I mean, you hear about Andrew Jackson and Old Hickory, and I mean, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, for Unitarians and Universalists, I mean, we claimed him, I mean, as one of our own, and proudly have him as part of our history. And then you get to the point where you start confronting that history, and it brings up some interesting questions. And how do you go forward with teaching the whole history. I'm one of those that if the monuments are coming down, I would say put them into a museum to where it can be a teaching experience. I don't think they necessarily need to be erased, but keeping them up where they are reminders of a very painful period for citizens of this country. I just don't. I think it's time for some of them to come down, if not all.
And definitely a lot of context with them, so that it's very clear what the situation was.
Well, and also with, I mean, any president acknowledging both any good that they did while they were president, but also acknowledging whatever they did that was bad. Obviously, there's certain presidents like Nixon. We all kind of know like the bad stuff. I don't know if he did any good things because I wasn't around when he was president. But for those that we've kind of put on this pedestal, also acknowledging the troubling things that they did while they were president.
Yep. I mean, just teaching the whole of history, as opposed to just cherry picking, and having that whitewashed, literally and figuratively, history that we get taught.
And I guess some of that would be looking at whatever history books are currently rotating throughout the education system and kind of going, okay, well, we need to add stuff, take away stuff, whatever, sort of thing, which obviously is easier said than to do. Obviously takes a lot of time to comb through that, add stuff, take away stuff, money to have to make new books, or maybe you don't even make new books, you introduce books that are out there, like this book, for example, or other books that, you know, instead of just reading Tennessee history, whatever's in school right now, it's like you read that, but you read this and a bunch of other stuff.
That will be a big political battle also.
Yep. Like I said, easier said to do. I mean, if any of this was easy, it would have already, either it wouldn't have taken place at all, or if it still took place, it would have been rectified a whole long time ago.
I believe there are some places that are starting to try, but that's not something I'm up on.
I believe there are in some states, but there are also some states that are going in the opposite direction, and also as evidenced by the current administration. They, I mean, think that, well, I mean, Andrew Jackson should be revered. I mean, there's a portrait of him hanging in the Oval Office right now.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ones that, according to Trump, that is one of the people that he looks up to.
And I wonder with like higher education, like people who are majoring either in childhood or early education or major in history, because I know they do offer like specific history things of like African American history or women history or something. I wonder if those are required or if those are electives, because if they're electives, I think they should be required.
Yep, I agree. Oh, hey, Gordon.
Hey.
Yeah. You know, I thought I'd chime in. Somebody I'm acquainted with, Jim Lowen, has a doctorate in sociology, but has done a lot of work in history, starting when he was teaching at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And he realized Tougaloo is a historically Black college, excellent one. And he realized his students were coming in with very whitewashed history of their state, and looked at the existing school textbooks and was appalled. He and a history professor at another college, well, a college that Mark knows, Millsaps, Charles Salas, started to work with some of their students and some other people to write a good factual Mississippi history. Actually, it's a magnificent book, won awards, but the State Textbook Commission did not put it on their approved list. It took a law site to get it on the approved list. It took more than a lawsuit. It really wasn't adopted very widely in Mississippi. It's still an excellent book. Jim later wrote the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, which pokes at many of the unfactual things that are in textbooks all across the country.
Well, my dad was an 8th grade American history teacher. Unfortunately, he's passed away, so I never had conversations about, I mean, I know what I studied in 8th grade, but as far as like what he learned as he was going for his like bachelor's and his master's in it, and, you know, if he was still alive in this day, it would be like, hey, so what did you learn? What do you feel like you missed? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I know I was a history major in college, and there was a bunch of stuff that I was not exposed to, but I wish I had known.
Yeah, it wasn't until college learned a lot of, I mean, Chris Weiss, our minister, he and I will talk about this one quite a few times. Is just one of the examples for me is Woodrow Wilson. And just I idolized him in high school with the League of Nations and World War I and the precursor to United Nations. And then you get into college and you find out just about how he welcomed the Klan March in Washington, D.C. and showed Birth of a Nation at the White House. And with the beginning of the Red Scare and the crackdown on immigrants. I don't, like I said, I don't think you should just completely not teach this, but you should teach the whole story.
Yeah.
And put it in context. It
Right.
certainly makes it not quite as bracing when you get to a certain point in your life, and it's like, well, everything I kind of learned was kind of shaded different by whoever was teaching it.
And Angelina joined us.
Yes, hi.
Hey, Angelina,
Sorry,
welcome.
mate.
Oh, it's okay. We were just talking about Jefferson and Jackson, and
And Woodrow Wilson, and I concur about Woodrow.
yep,
Right.
it's but I was going to move on here, and as you can see, we're about to get into Manifest Destiny. I accidentally forwarded the slide a little bit sooner than I meant to, but before we got completely into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the land specifically around here, Knoxville and the surrounding counties, surrounding area. Has anyone gotten to that portion of the book about the assault on the Cherokee Nation?
I read the whole thing, but it's been months, so I don't remember a lot. And I couldn't find my copy tonight. I don't know where I stuck it.
I just about had the same problem. I found it with 10 minutes to go. I'd filed it away last week and did not remember where I filed it. But Knoxville is spoken about and talked about in the book. It's page 87, The Birth of a Nation, and talks about some of the principal people that played a part in this area and the settlers coming. And one was John Sevier, and then other was Knox, who were named after.
And he take usually field trips to their places.
Yep.
Usually, like, I don't remember what grade, but I know that like usually at some point in history class you go and visit those places. Because it's like you have to know about Tennessee history, the white part of Tennessee history.
Before reading this book, I mean, I knew about the Trail of Tears, and I assumed that that was the whole story. And I mean, that is a huge part of the story. But I never really had come across much as far as Knoxville goes. Does anyone else, before I read something out of the book, know anything more about the area? Well, this is how the author puts it. In the unconquered indigenous region of the Old Southwest, parallel resistance took place during the 2 decades following U.S. independence, with similar tragic results, thanks to its extirpative settler warfare. Tennessee, at this point formally claimed but not settled by the British of North Carolina, was carved out of the larger Cherokee Nation and became a state in 1796. This is how she puts it. In the eastern part, particularly the area around today's Knoxville, it was a war zone. The Scotch-Irish, the squatters that had come in here illegally, they were at war with the resistant Cherokees, who were also called the Chickamaugas. They didn't care for the indigenous people, nor did they care for the federal government, who was trying to keep them from going farther and farther westward. So in 1784, a group of North Carolina settlers led by settler ranger John Sevier had succeeded from Western Carolina and established an independent country called Franklin, with Sevier as the president. Neither North Carolina nor the federal government had any control over the eastern Tennessee Valley region. In the summer of 1788, Sevier ordered an unprovoked preemptive attack on Chickamauga town, killing 30 villagers and forcing the survivors to flee south. Sevier's actions formed a template for settler-federal relations, with settlers implementing the federal government's final solution, while the federal government feigned an appearance of limiting settler invasions of indigenous lands. So there's more here as far as, let me just say one more thing about Sevier. This is in 1793. Sevier and his rangers invaded the Chickamaugas towns in 1793 with a stated mission of total destruction. Although forbidden by the federal agent to attack the villages, Sevier gave the order for a scorched earth offensive. So in squatter settlements, ruthless leaders like Sevier were not the exception, but the rule. Once they had full control and got what they wanted, they made their peace with the federal government, which in turn depended on their actions to expand the republic's territories. Sevier went on to serve as a U.S. representative from North Carolina and as a governor of Tennessee. To this day, such men are idolized as great heroes, embodying the essence of American spirit. A bronze statue of John Sevier in his ranger uniform stands today in the National Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol. So, gives you a new perspective when you're driving on John Sevier Highway. So, but yeah, I even looked a little bit before this book, and there was not a lot about Knoxville as far as the indigenous people that I found. I mean, I know, Angelina, you'd done some research as far.
Yeah, and I just posted in the chat there the link to the website where you can put in your address, and it tells you a little bit about the Yuchi there. I'm still looking for the other information. I thought I had saved it on here, but I'm not finding it. Which I just found that very interesting to hear how this Yuchi tribe was basically betrayed by the Cherokee, which I knew there, you know, it's romanticizing the native people to say there wasn't any infighting or wars between them, because there was.
Did anyone else have any thoughts about the surrounding area?
Well, I have some family history, not family history to be proud of. I'm descended from, I think it was the younger brother of someone named Alexander McMillan. And he and some companions had served in the colonial army in the Revolutionary War, and they they took a break from military service and hiked over to an area. Let's see, it's described as the cane break on the east side of the Holston River, about 3.5 miles east of where Knoxville was afterward located, which was then a dense cane break, and near the southeast landing of where Boys Ferry was years after established. So, they thought it was great and went hunting. The custom was for one to remain in camp and cook breakfast, that is, boil the venison and bake the Johnny cake, while the others were out looking for game. So now I will give, this is in a handwritten thing, I will give a little tragedy, just as an old friend and companion of both Uncle Alexander McMillan and also of my grandfather afterwards. He would tell it with such earnestness and energy that it had to be the truth. I could not think that he would story about it. When the Indians were first driven away from there, it was called Gillum Station or Fort. So one morning, when it was old Uncle Alexander McMillan's time to boil the venison and bake the Johnny cake, 5 great burly Indian bucks, well armed, came marching into camp along the path that had been trimmed out to pass back and forth. The Indians seemed to be delighted to find this white man there alone. So they would march around his fire, Indian file, each one break off a piece of Johnny cake and throw it in and chew it, and then spit it in his pot of venison and laugh, repeating this several times. So Uncle Alexander thought that was pretty hard for a man that had been a soldier as long as he had to stand. So he crawled quietly back under his cane arbor so he could lay his hand on his gun, and watched an opportunity and selected the most determined looking Indian and shot him dead. Then brained the second one, took his gun, and shot the third one dead, and also the fourth. And the fifth had started to run when the fourth was killed. The fifth was about to escape when his companions heard the firing at camp, came tearing in time to catch the fifth one as he was trying to escape, and killed him. So there was none left to tell the tale. So they came to the conclusion that they had better strike camp and go back up the river, Holston, a few miles, near to where there was some settlements. So they went some 12 or 15 miles up the river and stopped where Strawberry Plains was afterwards established by a McMillan. So that's...
This is a family member of yours?
Yep, I'm descended from a brother of his.
Very interesting, Gordon.
And it's not family history to be proud of, but it's family history to reckon with.
Yeah, to reckon with.
Thanks for sharing that, Gordon.
Yeah. It may throw your timing off for the class.
That is fine. I was just debating about there was some family sort of history connected with this book with me as well, and it's much later on. You had, and I just thought that they were just kind of trained by the Indians, and they were that's why they were called Indian Scouts, that's was more that they were tracking them down, hunting them, helping kill all the buffalo. One of my dad and I's ancestors was an Indian Scout connected with Buffalo Bill and Kit Carson, Texas Jack O'Mohendro. He died at a young age, but he more than likely participated in some of that. He was not anywhere near as well known as Buffalo Bill and Kit Carson, once because he did die at a young age. But he was one of the ones that they did a lot of the dime novels back in the day. And I don't think we should be ashamed of our heritage, but I'm sure a lot of us who are white, have stuff in our background that is not part of history that we're used to.
Yeah.
Well, and as I kind of think about it, there's a part of me, if you compare it to like modern day stuff, it's kind of like, are we really surprised there's hidden stuff? Because if you think in a modern day context, how much modern social issues have not been talked about until recently, like, you know, sexual abuse, physical abuse, alcohol, like all these modern day things that slowly over time more people are talking about. It's like, okay, if we can't even talk about modern day stuff in a somewhat context, should we be really surprised that we like haven't been able to talk about this terrible history from long ago? It's like we just keep as for some reason as this white society, we just decide if we don't talk about it, it didn't happen, and just kind of push it under the rug. And obviously there were times where, I mean, you don't have this as much now, but you look at modern day issues of like, if a girl was raped and she got pregnant, she was sent away because it was like thought to be her fault, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like we just kind of keep, in a way, hiding, like pretending that past doesn't happen, but just in different ways.
You know, it all falls into sort of the family secret kind of thing. The uncle, you don't talk about why, but you never leave him alone with the kids. We don't talk about it, but we kind of know it's there. And
then it just kind of keeps happening again. Like if you think about, like, you know, not just the Catholic Church, but obviously the Catholic Church was the one that had the big media storm with all the priests who were, you know, molesting people, but then they would just move them to a different church and just try to hide the problem. So it's very much this white idea of like, we'll just hide stuff. It didn't happen, but then look at who all gets hurt in that.
I think one of the takeaways from our history and revisiting it is that if you don't confront the past with the light of truth, and I mean, just looking at warts and all, I mean, the younger people that are growing up, they're not going to know their history, and I mean, have a bigger chance of repeating it.
And I was real involved with the dismantling racism work through the CJF organization and through National Coalition for Community and Justice. The leader challenged us white people to know our history and, like Gordon said, to reckon with it, you know, to know the family lineage and what it's contributed to the secrets of American history. And what do we want to do with it now, or about it now that we know?
And I know I've had some conversations that have come up that have a question's been asked: when did you realize you were white? And the truth of that was, I have no idea, because I have no recollection of it being a thing. I think I was the generation of being raised to be colorblind because that was thought to be a positive thing. But you hear so much from, you know, Black people and other people of color of having conversations, you know, with their parents or whoever raised them of this sort of thing. And I'm like, I don't remember that ever being a thing. I mean, all my memories. Yeah, well, but all my and even my memories though of anybody who was Black that I had friends with was, I never had any issue going over their house. They never had an issue coming to my house. As far as I can remember, any conversations between my parents and their parents seem very similar to conversations between my parents and the parents of white kids. So it was very much now, obviously, I don't know what happened behind closed doors, but it very much was an issue of like, I don't see color sort of thing. Whereas probably my Black friends, when they went home, there were very different kind of conversations going on, especially the older we got. sort of thing. Because I'm like, I really don't know when I realized I was white versus somebody else.
Yeah.
My sister and I were kept by Black women when we were little, probably up till I was 7. And we had one of them was there only a short time, and I don't know why. There was nothing that I never knew why she left. I was probably 4 or 5 then. But I remember her talking about having a sister who was white as milk.
Mhm.
And that was the first time I, was aware that there were differences of color and they apparently mattered.
Well, this has been a really good discussion, and I'm going to move us along. But I didn't want to cut it off just because, I mean, there is a lot you can get into. These are all really good conversations to have. So our next portion is called Manifest Destiny, Extravagant Violence. Let me pull up a slide here real quick. Let's see if I can do it correctly this time. Okay, yeah. All right. In the beginning, and this is from the book. This is summarizing the work of the military historian John Grenier, who investigated the development of irregular warfare in which people are not bound by military institutions or codes of behavior. They target civilians, food supplies, and homes. In the beginning, Anglo settlers organized irregular units to brutally attack and destroy unarmed indigenous women, children, and old people, using unlimited violence in unrelenting attacks. During nearly 2 centuries of British colonization, generations of settlers, mostly farmers, gained experience as Indian fighters outside any organized military institution. During the 18th century, Anglo settlers in North America waged deadly irregular warfare against the indigenous communities. The chief characteristic of irregular warfare is that of extreme violence against civilians, in this case to seek utter annihilation of the indigenous population. In cases where a rough balance of power existed, Grenier observes, and the Indians appeared dominant, as was the situation in virtually every frontier war until the first decade of the 19th century. Settler Americans were quick to turn to extravagant violence. By the time of Andrew Jackson, the indigenous peoples, villages, farmlands, towns, and entire nations formed the only barrier to the settlers' total freedom to acquire land and wealth. Such fighters are often viewed as courageous heroes, but killing the unarmed women, children, and old people and burning homes and fields required neither courage nor sacrifice. Extravagant violence. Let's take a moment to think about that.
Well, and kind of going with what you have on the slide,
Mm-hmm.
That it was destiny to expand across North America.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime anybody says, well, it's God's will, or it's, God will protect us or whatever, I feel like it's just like an excuse sometimes to do bad things and like not worry about, okay, heaven or hell, but what are you doing in this moment sort of thing? Because while I do believe in heaven and hell, like you shouldn't be so focused on that. You should be focused right now of like, what are you doing in this moment? sort of thing. And it's just an excuse for bad behavior. If you're like, well, I know it's God's destiny or God's will or whatever. You don't know that.
Manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, I mean, kind of go hand in hand. I mean, it was our destiny to have a country that stretched from sea to shining sea. And I believe that came directly out of the doctrine of discovery. But the questions we have here, and once again, Katie, I mean, just take out Unitarian Universalist faith and just think about it as far as, I mean, being a U.S. citizen. So what does our Unitarian Universalist faith require of us in the face of the truth that extravagant violence and genocidal warfare are a large part of the story of how the United States came to inhabit the land from sea to shining sea? What does your UU face asks of you as an individual person and your family?
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge it and make sure our community knows about it, particularly our younger people. It's important that we talk about it with them.
Yep.
I also think we need to ask any indigenous people that are around what they think should happen. I don't know. I don't have any good ideas of how to even say I'm sorry. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do know some things. There are promises that were made that we could easily own up to now and take care of some of the people on the reservations and that kind of thing. But we really need to make sure they guide anything that we do in response to learning this, in my opinion.
I was on a thing earlier today where our discussion was talking about just with our country being the way it is and everybody kind of deciding like to do the right thing. But the person brought up the point to do that, everybody has to be on the same page of what is the right thing in terms of ethics or faith or whatever. Like everybody has to have the same definition, because it's like we're all playing from different playbooks and our definitions of things are off. And so until we can come to like an understanding of what the right thing is to do in anything, it's going to be really hard to move forward and make things right, because everybody's seeing it from different playbooks, more or less. Well, because like you have people who will use, like, whether it be the Bible, whether it be the Constitution, and they will pick one part of the document that basically goes along with whatever they believe in, but then they completely ignore the rest of it because it doesn't go along with what they believe in. And I don't know how you change that, because then they're obviously on a different playbook than the rest of us. They're like, wait a minute. Yes, that's part of the document, but that's not the entire thing.
Well, I do believe there's common ground, but it's not going to be easy to get to it. But I think if we can start just by finding ways to like in Knoxville, the county, making sure, the city, whatever, I don't live in the city, but making sure that there are more equal facilities and services for all neighborhoods. And I think if we can start talking about those kinds of things, we'll be better off than if we start talking about things that are bigger trigger points. But, I don't know.
I think what you were saying earlier, Patsy, about getting input from the Native people. I think I mentioned last week about the program at the Mennonite University in Virginia that brought together descendants of the slaves and slave owners. They're doing something similar, getting around the table with Native peoples about what they'd like to see happen.
Yeah.
Yep. Chloe or Dad, y'all have been a little bit quiet. You want to have anything you want to talk about?
Well, I was just very shocked about the amount of violence. I remember learning in high school, or maybe before that, that Indians did the scalping. And then we learned that they may have learned it from the French. But from this book, it came from the Scot-Irish, who were already scalping in Ireland. And it's like, what? That was a shock. And then to find out that, like, the Rangers, and especially the Texas Rangers, who have we've idolized and think they're so great, they were the bad guys.
Yep.
And the killing of women and children and elders, burning them alive. I mean, it was a little hard to come to terms with the amount of violence, because that we did not learn. And here, I'm 79 years old, and I did not know that. I would think I would, but nope.
Maybe it's another responsibility we have to start finding out our own history.
Yeah.
Actively finding out about our own. I just within the last few days, I don't know what triggered this, but I was wondering if there is a book or if there's studies or any research on the Native American wives of white men. You know, what was the sociology behind it? What was going on? I don't know. I know that my great-great-grandmother family had moved to the area that my great-great-grandfather had moved. They had moved there also. But, I don't, it's just very mysterious. There was that side of my family doesn't really tell many stories anyway. I don't know much about anything, past what my dad remembered, and he didn't seem to remember stuff like my mom did. But anyway, I just wonder, if it was how those marriages came about. Were the women forced somehow? Although my great-great-grandmother's parents were there. I mean, they had moved there. I think she may have even been born there. I can't remember. I'll have to go back and look. But I know she went back to Georgia, which is where they had been, and that they were married. My great-great-grandparents were married in Georgia. So, I don't know if she had gone back to live with family there. She had gone, there's nothing, but I would just like to know if there's knowledge of how those things were going on, how they were happening back then.
That one I don't know.
Mark,
Yeah.
If you put those back up there, I would make a couple of comments. And you asked two questions about what does the Unitarian Universalist faith require of us? And of course, I'm still trying to learn how I fit in.
Sorry.
But the question was, what does it require of us? And then the next question was also pretty much focused on the peoples that are within the Unitarian Universalist Church. You know, we can't necessarily solve the whole world's ills, but what is required of us. And so if you look at it in just that context of you and me and people within the Unitarian Universalist faith, then our requirements are to shed light on the truth and to admit it among ourselves, and maybe we can pass along to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren some truths. It seems like a small thing to do. I find myself wanting to open the eyes and educate all citizens of the United States about trying to make up and trying to take on the cause of fair play. And we can't give all the lands back to the indigenous peoples, but we could recognize the wrongs and try to compensate a little better than we are today. But I don't know how we're going to translate that to the USA citizens from sea to shining sea. So what's required of us as Unitarian Universalists is to do our small part.
Well, and Patsy, you were asking about books about Indigenous women. I don't know because I haven't read these books, but I was just, you brought that up. So I did a quick Google search, and here's a book called Indigenous American Women, Decolonization, Empowerment, and Activism that came out in 2003.
Okay.
American.
Yeah, I know I hadn't gotten around to doing any looking yet.
Yeah, American Indian Women Telling Their Lives from 1987. So it looks like they're out there. It's just that they don't get the massive press sort of thing that probably a lot of other books do.
Yeah, well, I would be looking more. I mean, I would be looking more right now for early to mid 1800s. That I can't remember now exactly when they were married. But, and it was in the 1800s, early to mid 1800s, I think. I know that great grandfather was killed in the Confederacy. He was a Confederate soldier and died in 1861. So I think they'd been married maybe, I don't know, 10 or yeah, I think they were married right around the middle of the century.
Dad, were you still going there?
I believe I've wrapped up on what I was saying.
Appreciate Chloe.
I noticed one of the things that also impressed me at GA this last year was the amount of workshops and things they were doing on Indigenous people with Indigenous people leading those discussion groups.
That would be great. Yeah, I would have enjoyed that.
Well, I was in something where there's a woman, I think she lives in Virginia, and she's Native American, but I think a lot of what she gets, and she's probably around my age or so, but she still gets people who will say, negative things about her culture, whether it's how she's like wearing her hair or like food or just everyday things that as like a white person we probably take for granted. So it's also not only being aware of the past, but being aware of like not thinking before we speak or tweet or whatever we do, communicate. that, you know, words do matter.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of words, I mean, and this is, I think, can kind of go towards what my dad was saying. How do you do it as individuals? I mean, for one thing, I mean, being educated and being okay. I mean, and everyone's got their own level of comfort, but there's very, I mean, I'll say it's small, but it makes a ripple. But some of the language we use, a lot of, I mean, I think all of us know some of the language that is associated with history of racial injustice as far as Black people. I mean, like a cakewalk, some of the other ones. There's lots, and I didn't even realize them until I was reading this book. And just over the last little bit doing more investigation to where some portions of our language and slang and phrases come from, but those people are really going off the reservation. I mean, I don't know if how many of you are familiar with that phrase. I mean, where, I mean, someone gets upset, so you say they're going off the reservation. I mean, that's going straight to the treatment of indigenous people. Someone's an Indian giver.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Let's see, which side did not keep their promises?
Yep.
Well, this lady said something about, because right now there's a whole thing where people are talking about finding their tribe.
Yeah, that's another one.
And she said, in the group we were talking about, somebody had said that, and she says she was like okay with it because it can be a positive thing, that there's one word for tribe that means your exact immediate family, and there's a separate word that's like your extended family. And just explaining, like, in the group we were in, it was okay, but a lot of people use that and they don't really know what they're talking about or where it comes from.
Yep. I mean, not knowing the origins. I hear people say, this is my spirit animal. I've heard is, I mean, from some indigenous and native people, that's really offensive, because it's white people culturally appropriating and not knowing where those terms came from. This is interesting, and you'll come across this at the end of the book, but have all of you heard the term in country, going in country?
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure the context that most of us would know it from is the Vietnam War, where they would talk about how they were going in country when they were going on long patrols and stuff like that. That term comes from when Texas Rangers and Indian Scouts, and when they would go far into country, in country, I mean, cutting a swath across the country. They were going in country, and that, I mean, continued to this day, going over to Vietnam and the colonial attitudes that we had. I mean, as far as the Vietnam War went, it's a colonizer term that is still with us to this day.
We need a book like this book is anti-racist that the RE group has. We need it for the words. We need all that information somewhere accumulated, because I would have no idea.
It's a lot to keep track of. I assumed that one was from the Vietnam War, but it has its origins a lot earlier. So.
But the thing is, even if you had a book, my mom and I were talking about this the other day when it comes to whether you use the term Black or African American, is that she does a lot of community development, and she knows people that, like, you have to call them African American. Other people don't really care one way or another, because they would have to trace themselves way back to go back to Africa, but it's hard just by looking at them to know whether they're going to be offended by Black or African American. And yes, you can ask them, but like, as she said, sometimes she's good to remember everybody's name if you're at something. So how do you also not only remember their name, but also how they want to be referred to? And in some cases, I think some people really understand if you're truly trying and you make an effort, then other people are going to be really offended. And so even if you have a book, what works for one person of any race, ethnicity may not work for somebody else, especially if
Well,
you're.
it would definitely be a start.
Yeah, I mean, it
Mhm.
definitely, yeah.
And the asking gets easier, for me anyway. You know, it's hard to remember to ask at first, but after a while, I've gotten used to it. Of course, there's always then the next thing that you have to ask about, but
Well,
I
there's
think
always,
the more we
there's
know, I
also
think,
asking about preferred pronouns, which is one that we're all trying to get used to now.
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I learned in one of the RE things the other day, Catherine she was talking about the golden rule. And then I learned something new. It's called the platinum rule. And that's do unto others as they would like to be.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and wow, that was like very enlightening. And I think that this rule would fit with our work and with Indigenous and with Black.
Yep. Well,
I
I'm gonna,
know, I know.
And Katie, you are right. If you're trying, people generally do appreciate it very much.
Yep.
Well, because in fact, I subscribe to this anti-racist daily blog thing, and they had one thing that was kind of talking about that like whether it be Blacks or like in Hispanic community, but in the Hispanic community, some people relate more to the Hispanic side, some relate more to the Latin side, and so it's like, and even the writer was saying, you know, within her own family, she relates more to one side than her father does. So it's kind of going, we're trying, because, you know, as a white person, we don't have to say, well, I'm white British or, you know, whatever, like in terms of our background sort of thing. But yeah, I think, but then you have other people and who are justly upset that, you know, I think there has to be a balance in finding grace, I guess.
Call yourselves white people or Caucasians?
it's white people for me, because Caucasian I learned was basically a construct. So
Exactly.
Or Anglo-Saxon.
yeah. Well, I'm going to move this along, just because.
Before you move on, just some comment I would make as I was sitting here thinking, and just how we as individuals view and deal with Indigenous people. If you stop and think, okay, I'm going to go in the ghetto tonight. I think I'll just go down to the ghetto.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'm going to go to a ghetto. And you think of, if you just say that and think about what does your body tell you when you hear that? I recall driving into an Indian reservation a couple of times. Mark, you might have been with me. I can't remember for sure. But I certainly felt uncomfortable and out of place and very odd and maybe even a little frightened.
Where do you think that came from? I mean, do you think it was just, preconceived, of things that you were taught as growing up, that you were projecting onto that area?
Well, I don't know. I think for me, a ghetto is where people that have been, they're without, let's say, basic things. They're isolated. They're different. How do you communicate with them? On what level? And So I felt the same thing with the Indian reservation. It just came to me while I was sitting here talking, but I don't have a root that I don't know how to go back and figure out how I came to that thinking. It developed over years, I guess. But I guess a point I'm trying to make is that we have set the Indians off to one side, and we've set a lot of people off to one side. But we're talking about Indians, we're talking about indigenous people. I don't know how we open doors on our side, or how are we expecting them to open doors to us? I don't know.
So last week I was watching this thing with an uncomfortable conversation with a Black man, and he talked about, somebody asked a question about, if you're the only white person in a place, how do you kind of expand your network of people that look different from you? And he made a comment of, the world may be white, but your world does not have to be white. And basically it's like kind of having to step outside your comfort zone and go to and do it with a pure heart, obviously, but like talking to people, and obviously in this day and age is kind of difficult because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but still going to places that maybe you wouldn't normally go to because that's considered the Black people or the indigenous people or whatever, or just depending on what your job is, reaching out to people that are not your normal bubble. Like, we have to step outside of our bubble, and maybe us being uncomfortable is okay for a while because those groups of people have been uncomfortable for a very long time. And so we can kind of step in their shoes, so to speak.
Ed, I remember when we were moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we were driving around looking at apartments, and I had that very uncomfortable feeling because there were a lot of Black young people, probably students, but I don't know, but right near the entrance to one complex, and they just kind of stared at us as we went by. And I didn't meet their gaze. It was very uncomfortable for me. But then a few years later, I went back and started teaching again, and I had a lot of Black students, and I had a lot of Black parents to talk to, and I pretty quickly got very comfortable assuming that they were just people, because I learned that very quickly. My high school we had a few Black kids that started coming the year I was in the 10th grade. So I never went to school with many Black kids. And that was, I think that was as good as it felt like it was at the time. It went really smoothly. There weren't too many issues. And but anyway, I'm rambling. But at any rate, I think a lot of it is just, as Katie said, just getting ourselves where we can have those interactions and start thinking about them as real people and seeing that they are real people just like us, and that they can help us figure out, what the best path is to go forward and maybe make some amends.
Yeah. Were you just exercising your hand, Angelina, or did you have a question?
I was, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
stretching out.
I was going to comment that actually the observation I've heard Black people make is they have to know how to interact with Black people and white people. Very important skill for them to master. So they have to have a degree of comfort and coping skill in both societies. And I've seen some interesting comments to that effect. Interesting thought to have. You know, I can just limit myself to white society and I'll get by. Most Black people can't. They have to learn how to cope with those of us who identify as white.
And times if they don't learn how to do that, it can be deadly.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
And then
can
if
be
you're
deadly anyway.
And then
But
if you're biracial, that just makes things even more complicated because it's like I've heard people who are biracial say it's like they don't fit in they're either too white or they're too Black or too white in whatever the other is. And then ultimately sometimes it's almost like they have to pick one.
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been good conversation, and I'm going to move us along a little bit. And I hope that we will continue, that y'all will continue to have these conversations with other people. These are not easy. No, just these. I would like to let it go on, but I just want to get a little bit farther. But having conversations like this are not easy, and this is a good place to have some of these conversations and raise these questions. And I appreciate everyone's sharing and talking tonight. So we're going to move on into allotments and the settlers' freedom to acquire. This is from the book. By the late 1800s, the U.S. government had forced much of the surviving indigenous population onto small reservations, some in or near their homelands and others in Indian territory in what is currently Oklahoma. Many Americans, however, wanted reservations broken up so the land could be available for settlers. Its purpose was to destroy the communal value of indigenous nations by turning reservations into 160-acre parcels owned by individual tribal members. Unallotted lands were declared surplus and sold to settlers. Under the laws and policies of the U.S. government, Native nations lost 3/4 of the land base that they had held after decades of army attacks and wanton land grabs. These policies had a tremendously destructive social and economic impact on indigenous communities. I'm going to show. I'm still screen sharing, right? So.
Yes.
All right. So. You could go to downtown in the West or in the Midwest, all over the country, and find a poster like this. This is an actual poster. So who is the intended audience for this poster and for the policy of allotting this?
Obviously, white people.
Yep, certainly not the person pictured on it.
Right.
And I think the answer to this question is pretty much the same to the one that you just said, but who benefited from the allotment policy and who continues to benefit to this day?
We do.
Yep. The indigenous peoples, villages, farmlands, towns, and entire nations formed the only barrier to settlers' total freedom to acquire land and wealth. I'm going to go to the next slide. Whoop, and sorry about that. I still haven't, this is the first time I've ever used Google Slides, so I'm learning.
Good.
They are a pain in my experience.
It's been a challenge, but I've learned a lot of stuff during the pandemic. This is going to be one of them as well.
Well, I didn't use them enough. I would always just do it in PowerPoint and then copy it over to Google Slides.
See, I find it easier to do Google Slides than I ever did PowerPoint, but
I use those so much.
So
anyway.
with what I just read and just what we just saw, like, How did these policies enhance the settlers' total freedom to acquire land? How does what the settlers meant by freedom differ from freedom that means liberation? And how much of the kind of freedom referred to in the quote, the freedom to acquire, is still part of the meaning of freedom when it is used in a civic or public context in the United States today?
I think with the freedom, it's with this may not be written, but with this understanding that it's whatever freedom means to the white person, that they get to decide what that means, and not, even though it doesn't say freedom only to white people, it was like this clear understanding that that part was just kind of there underneath. And obviously we still do that to this day, and especially for those people who are not only white, but white, male, straight, able-bodied, pretty much Protestant type things, like, and rich. I mean, although if you're poorer, you still have a leg up than other people, but like whatever they decide, that's what freedom or any other word means.
Certainly in the gun rights, it's acquisition. Freedom to acquire guns.
Well, even the policies we have today, we're still taking land from indigenous people, and we're taking land from ourselves with the policies that we're enacted. We set aside national parks, which you get into a whole nother thing there. Some of those parks are native lands, but we set them aside to kind of keep them for generations down the line. And over the last 4 years, not even just the last 4 years, shrinking those more and more so that we can take minerals and resources out of the ground, use the salt domes to store radioactive waste. So it's a freedom to just keep on, the freedom that the settlers were given, and that's, I mean, still is what that way it's looked at today, is it's the freedom to take whatever you want if you're white or the group that's in power. Yeah, Chloe.
And today they gave the oil companies can now drill on Alaskan parks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can bid for the part they want so that they can get the minerals out.
Yeah.
And they're hoping to have the sales done before the inauguration.
Yep.
I think it's also, when you look at freedom, like the whole mask thing.
I know.
People are like, you're taking away my freedom. And it's like, it's a very individualistic component as opposed to what is best for the common, for everybody and from the common good. It's very much like it's all about me sort of mentality.
Yeah.
Freedom of religion has just been bastardized, if you ask me, because it's being used to being used in ways that have nothing to do with whether people can exercise their religion or not. The religious freedoms that they're talking about now are not true religious freedoms. They're their rights to discriminate against other people. They have nothing to do with whether these people can exercise their religions the way they want to or not. Anyway, that's a tangent.
We've had a few of those tonight. I think it's fun.
It's just like right now, it's the type of world we're living in, where it's, especially like, I know for me, not only where I work, but so many other things going on where it's like, am I the only one that's seeing this sometimes? So it's nice to be around people who also get it.
It is.
Well, and I know my mom was saying she read an article that was written from somebody in Ireland, and this was several months ago, but they said other countries have always had, whether it be good, bad, whatever, of the United States, but this is the first time the word pity has been used about us. The other countries pity us. Like, that's not a word that's really ever been used before by other countries because of everything that's going on.
Why are they pitying us?
Why?
Mm-hmm.
I think between how the pandemic was handled or not handled, or all the, you know, racial and other injustices going on, that we obviously don't have governments, both on our current administration, but also just on a state and local level, that we can trust in. We are very individualistic as opposed to other countries who may have complained about their lockdowns, but they kind of, in the short term, they complained about it, but then they realized that it was for the greater good. So kind of went, okay, I'm going to do what I've got to do, sort of thing.
Right.
Angelina, I could forward you the editorial. It was by an Irish commentator. It was in the Belfast Times, the Dublin Times. It came out earlier this year when things were, I mean, we weren't even close to the election, and it was when everything was just completely spiraling out of control. It may have even been before the pandemic, but it had a lot to do with the fact that just with the current administration and just how far we had fallen and just how much we were becoming just an untrustworthy agent on the international stage. And that we were the ones that a lot of people looked up to, and now it was like they could see just how far we were falling, and that's where some of the stuff as far as pitying us came from. Seeing that we were being our own worst enemy, and that we were, but it's a really good editorial, and if anyone is interested, I can forward it.
Please do.
It made the rounds on Facebook for at least a month and a half. So,
well, and the thing is, like, okay, we can say the negative stuff we want about the current administration, which they deserve it, but at the same time, maybe not we as in the individuals on this call, but we as a society are the ones that voted him in and voted the people that, and even now as he's trying to sue everybody and the people that are part of his party are not calling him out on it, but yet we continue to vote those people in. So yeah, we kind of as a collective country only have ourselves to blame for where we've gotten, sort of thing.
The reality is we, the people, did not vote him in.
Well,
the popular vote voted in Hillary. It was the Electoral College.
But that's true. But just based off how our country system is set up, and until that's the rules or the law, and until we're able to change that, but part of that is also changing people on a local level who are willing to stand up to the Trumps of the world.
I was still surprised in the election how many people actually voted for him.
Oh yeah.
And that's the thing too, is that yes, Biden has won, but you still have a lot of people who still see nothing wrong with what he did. And then if you look in like Knoxville, I know the Saturday when it was announced that evening, they were asking like various people in Tennessee, like, oh, what your thoughts are. And so many of them were going along with Trump and saying, well, we believe he's right and that all the legal votes should be counted.
I'm going to move us along just so I can cover two last things before we run out of time. The next section had to do with the indigenous resistance to boarding schools, where they would, just to summarize, they would take indigenous children. Sometimes their parents would willfully give them to the authorities just so they might have a chance at a better life. But they would put them into boarding schools where they had their hair cut in an Anglo fashion. They weren't allowed to use their own language, and they were severely punished for doing so. And there was a lot of physical, sexual abuse that took place to them. And it was in the, they wanted them to be assimilated to where they would, well, they would become part of the white United States, and they would go away. The Australians did something very similar, and there's a great movie about it called Rabbit Proof Fence. But they did the same thing where they took the Aboriginal children, put them in a white boarding school, and basically tried to get them to forget their heritage, their language, their culture. And this is where we, as a country in Australia, went about things a little bit differently. Australia had a national reconciliation with the Aboriginal people and went through a reconciliation process. Not say it's perfect, but they had, and yes, they're not as populous a country as we are, but it was a really big deal when Yvonne Goolagong, I think that was who it was, carried the torch in the Olympics in Sydney. And I could be wrong on that, but I know it was an Aboriginal person that carried the torch when the last Olympics were in Australia. And so they went through a process of reconciliation. And I mean, that's an ongoing process in any country. I mean, it's going on still in Rwanda between the Hutu and the Tutsis, and still going on in South Africa. But at least they started going in this direction. I don't think, and this is my own personal opinion, I don't think we've scratched the surface of reconciliation with a lot of our past, whether it be with any people of color, indigenous. But that's just, sorry, I got off on my own little tangent there. But there was a lot of resistance, and that the indigenous children here in the United States continue to resist. That's why we still know about their culture. And it was not an easy thing. I mean, Native women were still forced into sterilization as late as 1971.
Native women are still turning up missing.
Yep. You said men or women?
Women.
Yeah.
Native
Okay.
women.
I was just making sure I heard it right. Yeah, and no one wants to do anything about it. They either say that, they got drunk and just they'll come home eventually. But it's like you can, the reservations could be used as a hunting ground for sexual predators. I mean, because the native jurisdiction, they don't have the manpower, and the white sheriffs don't really want anything to do with it. So, but I wanted to get to this one quote about multiculturalism and assimilation. And so just think about this next reading while holding in mind the cross-generational trauma caused by forced assimilation through boarding school. Multiculturalism became the cutting edge of post-civil rights movement U.S. history revisionism. The multicultural approach emphasized the contributions of individuals from oppressed groups to the country's assumed greatness. Indigenous people were thus credited with corn, beans, buckskin, log cabins, parkas, maple syrup, canoes, hundreds of place names, Thanksgiving, and even the concepts of democracy and federalism. But this idea of the gift-giving Indian helping to establish and enrich the development of the United States is an insidious smokescreen meant to obscure the fact that the very existence of the country is a result of the looting of an entire continent for its resources. And any thoughts about that?
Hard to know what to think.
It's a lot. I mean, and I'm sorry I'm rushing a little bit through this last little bit, but I wanted to get to at least a little stopping point. I mean, well, at least a place where we could kind of sum up. But
well, like I said, I read it a long, months ago, but still, it's hard to wrap your head around this stuff.
Yep.
Well, and you mentioned Thanksgiving, and obviously that's coming up soon. But I think even if I don't think we celebrate it, forgetting the indigenous people part of it, but Thanksgiving, you're supposed to be thankful for things and like important things, not going to go shopping on Black Friday type thing. So I think even if we're not celebrating it for the right reasons, we've kind of lost whatever it was meant to be back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's all about Black Friday shopping, football, and food. I mean, food's important, but still.
Well, I just wanted to get to that one part about just to have you think a little bit about, yeah, the Indian gave us, I mean, corn and all this stuff, and so yeah, they helped make us a good country. The country was good when they were there as well. So, or when, I mean, it still are. I mean, even I lapsed into that they were gone. So just as closing, just want to bring up a few resources, and I can email all of you these. But when the boarding schools were put in place and when the United States was looking for people to help with the reservations and help govern those and help do assimilation, some of the institutions that they looked towards were the denominations. And so the Methodists had a reservation, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, they all had reservations. The Unitarians had a reservation. Ours was with the Utes in Utah. And we had a reconciliation. Gordon, was it 2008, do you remember? Nope, you may not be there.
I don't remember the date on that.
I'm looking to see if I can have it here. There's a documentary that shows, I mean, there's a video clip that that goes into that. And that's one of the things that I'll forward you on this resource list if you're interested in seeing it. But it was out in Salt Lake City, and they had the elder from the Utes come, and there was a gesture of reconciliation between the UUA and that tribe. I think, and this is coming from Unitarian Universalists, that we did better than most, but we still were not anywhere near great about doing it. I mean, yes, there were other denominations that were probably a lot worse than what we did, but we still were involved with it. And a lot of it was with all the denominations, it was playing into the white man's burden that we needed to educate the noble savage and raise them up. So there's that documentary to take a look at. There's lots of different things as far as readings that you can look at. There is another book by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz called All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths about Native Americans. It's really good. It does go over some of the same ground, but it's still well worth reading. And there is a link that I posted on our Facebook page as far as some events next week that is from the UUA, as far as some things that you can participate in that relate directly to the 400-year anniversary of 1619 and the founding of the Plymouth Plantation. It's some stuff I think that is coming out of GA and the stuff that they had hoped to do in person with the stuff with the Wampanoag, but I did post it on our website. You can also go to the UUA's website and find it as well. So, like I said, I can forward you a lot of these resources if you are interested in taking a look at them. So, Chloe, you're muted.
Yes, Mark, I would like that. Thank you.
Okay, I can send it to
Me
you.
too.
All right, Patsy.
Me too.
All right, Dan.
And Katie raised her hand.
Okay. And so, for those of you who have not finished the book, or even started it, I would highly recommend finishing it. It's not an easy read, but it's. I feel like, in my opinion, for me, it wasn't as dry as some history books that I've read in the past. And there are things in there that are very important to learn about, and also be able to talk to other people about, which that's the way we make those small little changes, those ripples in the pond that can grow, and that we can make those incremental changes that will change things over time. Still got a couple of more minutes if anybody wants to ask a question or share a thought that's come up before we close out.
I guess the thing that we have to be careful of as white liberals is moving in and thinking we know what needs to be done. We don't.
Nope. The white savior complex.
And at the same time, not falling apart when we realize we've made a mistake and that kind of thing, because we tend to do that too. And then it becomes the other person's responsibility to comfort us and tell us it was okay. And
Yep.
Yeah, it is a fine line between not being a white savior, but also not saying, please teach me, because it's on us to learn. So how do you balance that?
It's tricky.
How does Unitarian Universalism do as far as something analogous to missionary work on Indian reservations?
Just my first thought on that is what we just talked about, where back in the 1800s, that would have been the Unitarian Association at that point, that they agreed to go along with it. I don't know if it was whether or not to evangelize or just to look after. Gordon, you might be able to shed a little bit more light on this one than I would.
Yeah. Actually, this is one where our former minister, John Burens, has done some good work. Essentially, with the Utes, we sent a minister out there who sized things up and thought, well, these people know what they're doing on this land that's very familiar to them. I know my instructions said I'm supposed to show them how to become good Massachusetts farmers, but that doesn't seem like a really good idea. I have some good reading to do, and basically I'll leave them alone and tell them if they need something, come and see me. So it was not, heavy duty missionary work. Later, late 19th, early 20th century, the Unitarian Association president, Samuel Eliot, did do some work, some of it perfectly awful, and some of it really, really good, which was, that was Sam Eliot. some very good and some awful. And one of the good things he was able to do was speak up in congressional hearings. He was regarded as a very knowledgeable white man about Indian needs. And in at least one instance, he was able to either stave off or mitigate a really stupid move that Congress was about to impose on the various tribal groups. I forget the details of what it was, but an imperfect person who was doing something reasonably well in that case. So.
Did that answer your question, Dad, or were you talking about in a broader sense as well, whether or not we did missionary work?
Oh, you're muted, Ed.
You're muted, Dad.
I was more thinking along the lines of I don't know, reaching across the fence line and shaking hands some way or another. So how do you establish links, contacts, interactions? And is that something that Unitarian Universalist people are doing?
So you're talking about the current reservations and going and
yeah.
trying to.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
There, I think some positive work has been done. I know the Unitarian Service Committee did some, I think, culturally appropriate work, I believe, with the Navajo Nation. Way back in history, and I'd have to reread the accounts of this with my current understanding, but way early, there was a minister in what would become the Unitarian tradition, John Eliot, who was, who did do essentially missionary work with the Indians in the Boston area. But to his credit, attempted to meet them at least partway on their territory, in their language. And certainly not the worst white person in that context. So
maybe what I was trying to say is, let's say that maybe the Navajo reservation doesn't have a legal aid society or doesn't have a social worker. The Unitarian Universalist Church is going to somehow or other have a storefront there, and I'm going to sit there behind a desk and I'm going to wait, and maybe somebody will come along and ask me a question and I can help them.
With the charge, as far as current times, the charge that we voted on in 2016, and there'd already been work. I mean, like I referred to with the Unitarians and the Utes, where there was the reconciliation in Salt Lake City. I'm not sure how each church, each congregation is going about this, but in 2016, we voted at General Assembly. We passed a resolution to rethink Thanksgiving and our relationship to Indigenous people. And that was spearheaded, I'm not sure which congregation it was up in Massachusetts, but that was sparked by dialogue with the Wampanoag up there, and that our General Assembly this last year, if we'd had it in person, that was going to be a big piece of our General Assembly. But we were charged to reach out to the local tribes that are in the area and start that dialogue and see what we can do to have a relationship. It's a little bit harder and problematic in a pandemic, but we had been talking. Gordon, I think you'd been involved with some of the talks, and Carol over at Westside. We were looking at pursuing some of this and having a field trip up to Cherokee, North Carolina. And I know that that's an extremely important thing for Carol Bedeau over at Westside, and that she has contacts. And as soon as the pandemic is over with, that is something that we can look at as far as having those dialogues with the 4 churches in the area.
Yep.
So, but we are about 8:26. I really appreciate all the discussion and y'all's time. I certainly, there are aspects of this that we could talk probably for days on end and still not reach a conclusion. But I challenge you to, as you go forth, learn more, have what sometimes are difficult conversations as far as dealing with Black, Indigenous people of color. Don't be afraid to make a mistake and don't expect them to do the work for you. And those are my words of wisdom before I close this out with, well, I've already extinguished the chalice because I'm in a smaller room in my loft today and I didn't want to take a chance on starting a fire. So,
No fire, please.
no fire. So our closing comes from Article 7, 8, and 9 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples, and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to an indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. No discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such a right. So, thank you all once again. So,
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening.
I
Thank you for reading.
Bye.
I enjoyed.
Bye.